I'm not trying to get myself in trouble again, but I just want to fight and make money. I'm 36, I'm not getting any younger.
From Sterling's 8 years of loyalty met with silence, to Rousey calling the UFC one of the worst places to make a living, to Jones, the greatest of all time, being offered the same check as a boxer nobody's heard of, the UFC fighters have finally had enough. Aljamain Sterling. Born in 1989 on Long Island, New York, to Jamaican immigrant parents, Sterling didn't grow up with a golden path handed to him. He wrestled in high school, dabbled briefly in college, and made his professional MMA debut in 2012, fighting through smaller promotions on sheer will alone before the UFC came knocking in 2013. His debut came against Cody Gibson, a quiet entrance for a man who would one day be champion, but Sterling was never just a fighter. He was a technician, a grappling specialist with slick back takes, seamless transitions, and rear naked chokes that looked almost surgical. He climbed methodically through the bantamweight division, earning a title shot against TJ Dillashaw in 2018, fell short, rebuilt, and finally claimed the bantamweight championship in 2021 at UFC 259 by submitting Peter Yan in a performance that was controversial but undeniably decisive. He went on to defend the belt twice, against Yan in the rematch and against Sean O'Malley before O'Malley captured it in 2023. As of early 2026, Sterling's UFC record stands at 16-4, with victories over elite competitors like Corey Sandhagen, Pedro Munhoz, and Henry Cejudo. 8+ years in the octagon, a former champion, and still not making what he believes he deserves, because in 2026, Aljamain Sterling isn't measured in his frustration anymore. He's done measuring. During a sit-down with Ariel Helwani, Sterling unloaded everything he'd been carrying. The conversation turned to Zuffa Boxing's reported $15 million deal for Conor Benn, a figure that landed on the UFC roster like a grenade. Sterling didn't dodge it, he detonated it. He pointed out a painful and almost absurd irony, that the same organization raking in $7.7 billion from a single media deal with Paramount couldn't produce a single fighter who had ever commanded $15 million for one fight. Not one. Not in all the years fighters have been building this sport, sacrificing their bodies, their time, their mental health, their families. Not one has seen a number like that. Meanwhile, an outsider steps in for one boxing match and gets what no UFC champion has ever received. There is no negotiating, Sterling declared, words that hit harder because they came from someone who has been through the system, played by its rules, and wore its championship belt. He didn't accuse the UFC of malice so much as a deeply broken structure, one that leaves fighters supplementing their income with side jobs while the promotion quietly expands into a billion-dollar media empire.
I'm not trying to get myself in trouble again, but I just want to fight and make money. I'm 36, I'm not getting any younger.
At 36 years old, still competing at the highest level, Sterling isn't making idle noise. He's speaking from 8 years of experience, from being the guy who clawed his way to the top and looked around and still saw a broken system. His 2026 stance is one of impatient realism, respect for what the UFC has built, coupled with a demand that it stop treating its most dedicated athletes as an afterthought. Sterling's critique is personal and volcanic. He's a former champion demanding to be valued like one, but the next man on this list takes a slightly different approach. Measured, strategic, and stinging in a way only a true wordsmith can manage. Meet Israel Adesanya, and when the last stylebender speaks, he doesn't shout, he cuts. Israel Adesanya. He is one of the most fascinating human beings in modern combat sports, a Nigerian New Zealander who grew up consuming anime, absorbed taekwondo as a child, ascended to become a world-class kickboxer with a 75-6 amateur record, and then translated all of that artistry into UFC gold. Born in Lagos in 1989 and raised in New Zealand, Israel Adesanya debuted in the UFC in 2018 and was fighting for a middleweight title just 18 months later, dethroning Robert Whittaker in dominant fashion at UFC 243 in front of a roaring Australian crowd. He defended that belt 5 times against elite competition: Yoel Romero, Paulo Costa, Marvin Vettori, Jared Cannonier. He briefly moved to light heavyweight, lost to John Błachowicz, came back, regained the middleweight gold in 2023, and then dropped it to the raw, relentless Sean Strickland. When Zuffa Boxing's $15 million Benn deal made waves, Adesanya didn't rage. He reasoned, and that made it far more unsettling. Taking to his platform, he addressed Dana White directly, urging the UFC boss not to forget what brought you to the game. Coming from one of the promotion's biggest stars, that line carried the weight of a verdict, not just an opinion. Adesanya wants $15 million, not as a fantasy, as a statement of what UFC superstars of his caliber are owed given the scale of the organization's revenue. He acknowledged the bonus increases from $50,000 to $100,000 following the Paramount deal, but dismissed them as insufficient. It's not even guaranteed, he reminded his audience, because UFC bonuses, unlike base pay, must be earned in the cage on the night. You can fight a war, take punishment punishment that will follow you for years, and walk away with your base, show money and nothing else. Adesanya's frustration runs deep, not because he's bitter, but because the math insults anyone willing to look at it honestly. A one-off boxing match commands $15 million from the UFC's own parent company. A multi-fight UFC title run, years of sacrifice, of building the brand, of filling arenas, commands far less. He has called for revenue sharing, for fighters to receive windfalls that match their star power rather than incremental crumbs from billion-dollar deals. Adesanya speaks with a poet's precision and a businessman's clarity. The next fighter operates from a different tradition entirely, equal parts showman and philosopher, a man whose flashy exterior conceals a very sharp sense of fairness. Michael Venom Page has seen the business from Bellator, from the UFC, and from the outside, and what he sees, he's not afraid to describe. Michael Venom Page. He's the kind of fighter who makes entire arenas forget what sport they came to watch. Born in 1987 in London to a Trinidadian family, Page developed a martial arts style so unusual, blending taekwondo, capoeira, and showmanship into something entirely his own, that the first time most people saw him, they weren't sure what they were looking at. Spinning heel kicks landed like artillery. Pre-fight dances turned walkouts into performance art. He went 18-1 in Bellator, building a global following on the strength of highlight reel finishes and a charisma so thick it practically needed its own weight class. When Page joined the UFC in 2023, the welterweight division gained its most spectacular new addition in years. His record in the octagon stands at 3-1 as of 2026, featuring a spinning heel kick KO of Kevin Holland that circulated on social media for weeks. He's faced Ian Gary and other elite competition, establishing himself as a legitimate threat and a marketing dream. But behind the dancing and the drama, Page has always been clear-eyed about the economics of fighting. And in 2026, he made that clarity public in the most direct terms he's used yet. Sitting down with Ariel Helwani following the news of Conor Benn's reported $15 million Zuffa deal, Page said he was not happy, a phrase that, in his measured British delivery, landed harder than most fighters' loudest rants. He called it upsetting, not surprising necessarily, but genuinely upsetting, to see an outsider handed 8 figures for a single night while fighters who spent years building the UFC's fan base, who are the reason the Paramount deal exists at all, receive incrementally upgraded bonuses that still don't come close to changing lives in any meaningful way. Page's critique is principled and personal, a man who believes in fairness and has the platform to demand it. But if you want to understand the absolute ceiling of what a UFC fighter's leverage looks like, what it sounds like when the greatest fighter who ever lived decides he's had enough, you need to hear from Jon Jones, because when Bones speaks, even the UFC has to listen. Jon Jones. There is no rational argument against Jon Jones being the greatest mixed martial artist in the history of the sport. Born in 1987 in Rochester, New York, Jones debuted in the UFC in 2008 and became light heavyweight champion at 23, the youngest in UFC history. He didn't just hold the belt, he held it like a landlord holds a deed. 11 title defenses across 2 reigns, wins over Daniel Cormier, Alexander Gustafsson, Cyril Gane, a 27-1 record with 1 no contest, a move to heavyweight in 2023 that immediately produced a new championship, his reach advantage, his unorthodox creativity in the cage, his ability to combine wrestling and striking into something that looks almost unfair, all of it adds up to a career without peer. Off the cage, Jones has been his own worst enemy at times. Legal issues, PED suspensions, public controversies that have tested even his most devoted supporters. But through all of it, his ability inside the octagon has remained untouched, unquestioned, and perhaps more importantly for our purposes, he has always negotiated with the confidence of a man who knows he cannot be replaced. He has walked away from deals before. He has held out before. He has leveraged his status before. And in 2026, he did it again, loudly, publicly, and with the kind of defiance that only the greatest of all time can sustain. Jones revealed in 2026 that the UFC had offered him $15 million for a fight on a White House card. $15 million, the exact same figure that Zuffa Boxing reportedly handed to Conor Benn for a single boxing match, for the greatest fighter who has ever lived, for the man who filled arenas, carried pay-per-views, and built the light heavyweight division into what it is. Jones called it crazy. He called for his release, and in doing so, he didn't just voice personal frustration. He handed every other fighter on the roster a mirror and forced them to see what their leverage was actually worth. Because here's the context that makes the $15 million number even more insulting. Jones had reportedly turned down more than that amount for a fight against Tom Aspinall, the man widely considered the best active heavyweight in the world. He turned that down, and the UFC's response apparently was to come back with the same figure for an interim defense, for an undisputed champion. The math, as Michael Venom Page would say, doesn't math. Jones represents the ceiling, the GOAT card played openly. But the heavyweight division's most compelling story of the moment isn't Jones refusing to fight. It's the man who is willing, able, and frankly desperate to fight him. and who has started looking elsewhere for opportunities because waiting for Jones may not be worth it anymore. Tom Aspinall is the next chapter. Tom Aspinall. Tom Aspinall's rise has been one of the most exhilarating stories in recent UFC history. Born in 1993 in Bolton, England, the kind of no-frills, working-class northern English city that tends to produce fighters with something to prove, Aspinall entered the UFC in 2021 and hasn't really slowed down since. His record stands at 15-3, and those 3 losses are ancient history by comparison to the man he's become. Since returning from a knee injury that threatened to derail his career, Aspinall has been virtually untouchable, with devastating quick finishes over Sergey Pavlovich and Curtis Blades that showcased a heavyweight who combines power, speed, and technical sophistication in ways the division rarely sees. He claimed the interim heavyweight title in 2023 and has been holding it and holding his breath ever since, waiting for Jon Jones to return and unify the belts. The wait has been long, the frustration has been real, and in 2026, Aspinall made a move that said everything about where his head is. He signed with Eddie Hearn's Matchroom Talent Agency, one of the most powerful boxing management firms in the world, to explore earnings opportunities outside the UFC.
I think that UFC fighters, especially at the top level, should get paid more.
Aspinall has been refreshingly blunt about all of it. The Ben deal has bothered everybody, he said. Not just him, not just the big names, but the whole roster. And his frustration is rooted in a simple, stinging observation. One guy's getting paid $15 million and the other guy's getting $15K. That contrast, $15 million versus $15,000, captures the absurdity of where things stand following the Paramount deal more vividly than any economic analysis could. Aspinall represents the new generation of fighters, globally aware, commercially savvy, and unwilling to simply accept what's offered because it's better than nothing. But no conversation about UFC pay would be complete without the woman who pioneered the entire women's MMA movement, the one who didn't just open doors, but built the entire doorframe. Ronda Rousey has something to say, and as always, she does not mince words. Ronda Rousey.
It's no longer, it's one of the worst places to go. It's one of the, it's why so many of their top athletes are leaving to go and find pay elsewhere.
She did not just compete in the UFC. She created a world in which women's MMA could exist within the UFC at all. Born in 1987 in Riverside, California, Rousey came to the sport as an Olympic bronze medalist in judo, a genuine international champion before she ever threw a punch in anger. She turned professional in MMA in 2011, and by 2013, when she signed with the UFC, she became the organization's first female champion. The magnitude of that moment is difficult to overstate. The UFC had never featured women fighters before. Rousey didn't just break a ceiling, she built an entirely new floor. She went 12-2 in the UFC, defending the bantamweight title multiple times, defeating world-class opponents, and drawing mainstream audiences who had never paid attention to MMA before. Her losses to Holly Holm and Amanda Nunes were brutal and public, leading to a retirement in 2016 and a brief, unsuccessful return attempt. Since stepping away, Rousey has pursued acting, professional wrestling, and other ventures, and has maintained a public profile far beyond what most retired fighters manage. She is the reason women's UFC exists, and in 2026, the reason she's speaking out is precisely that, because she helped build this house and she's watching the people living in it get underpaid. Rousey's 2026 comments on UFC pay are the most scorching on this entire list. She called the UFC one of the worst places to make a living, a sentence that landed like a bomb because of who was saying it. This wasn't a fringe fighter with grievances. This was the woman who made women's UFC possible, who fought under the banner of an organization she helped legitimize, calling that same organization a financial disaster for the athletes inside it. She cited fighters turning to platforms like OnlyFans just to survive. She described a poverty-level existence coexisting with billion-dollar media deals. She drew from her own experiences of undervaluation, of being a star who generated enormous revenue while remaining locked in a structure that didn't reward that contribution proportionally. Rousey brings the history and the moral authority of a pioneer demanding better for those who followed her. But sometimes the most revealing perspective comes not from the loudest voice in the room, but from the most experienced one in the corner. Max Holloway has been in this sport long enough to know exactly what it will take to change it, and his message isn't just about money, it's about unity. Max Holloway. He has become over 14 years in professional MMA, something that is almost impossible to manufacture. A genuinely beloved fighter. Born on December 4th, 1991 in Honolulu, Hawaii, Holloway grew up in circumstances that weren't easy, turned to martial arts as a teenager, and made his professional debut in 2010. He joined the UFC in 2012 at just 20 years old, one of the youngest fighters on the roster, and immediately ran into the cold water of elite competition. Early losses to Cub Swanson and Ricardo Lamas would have derailed most careers. Instead, they became fuel. Holloway transformed himself. He developed one of the most relentless volume-striking games in UFC history, built on pace, cardio, and precision that seemed to improve with every round. He captured the featherweight championship in 2017 by defeating Jose Aldo, an iconic, decisive victory, then defended it 3 times in wars that cemented his legacy. Even after losing the title to Alexander Volkanovski in 2019, Holloway kept climbing. He won the BMF title with a knockout of Justin Gaethje at UFC 300 in 2024. That ranks among the most dramatic finishes in the event's history. His UFC record sits at approximately 26-7, with the most wins in company history. He has headlined cards across the world, and through all of it, Holloway has remained humble, family-oriented, and almost disarmingly positive. The rare elite athlete who is equally celebrated for who he is as for what he does. That character, optimistic, team-minded, and deeply principled, is exactly what showed up when Holloway addressed the pay crisis on Demetrius Johnson's YouTube channel ahead of UFC 326, where he was set to face Charles Oliveira in a BMF title rematch. He described the Ben deal as crazy. He acknowledged the bump in performance bonuses from $50,000 to $100,000. And then he said what no amount of money could quite substitute for: fighters need to fight for each other. The implication is both simple and profound. Fighter solidarity is the only genuine leverage a roster without a union possesses. When fighters undercut each other's negotiations, when one athlete publicly announces he'll do it cheaper, faster, and without complaint, the entire room loses bargaining power. Holloway understands this. Holloway's message is about solidarity, the idea that the tide can rise for everyone if fighters stop pulling each other down. But sometimes you need someone to apply a reality check to that idealism. Someone who has been there, done the math, watched the machine operate, and can tell you clearly and without sentiment exactly how hard change is going to be. Matt Brown has been waiting for that fight his whole career, in a different kind of cage. Matt Brown. He earned his nickname the hard way. Born January 10, 1981 in Xenia, Ohio, Brown is the kind of fighter who defines what it means to leave everything in the cage, often quite literally. He turned professional in 2006, joined the UFC in 2008, and over the course of 28 appearances compiled a 23-18 record that tells almost nothing about how memorable those fights were. Numbers don't capture what Brown brought to the octagon: relentless aggression, an iron chin, a heart that refused to recognize the word quit. His wars with Robbie Lawler produced 2 Fight of the Night performances. His battles with Diego Sanchez and Mike Swick became touchstones of an era. Brown never won a title, but he became something that titles can't quite confer: a fighter's fighter, a fan favorite, a man whose presence on a card guaranteed that something real was going to happen. He retired in 2019 after a remarkable run, came back briefly in 2021, and has since moved into podcasting, analysis, and commentary, where his straightforward, no-nonsense style has made him one of MMA's most trusted voices. At 45 and no longer competing, Brown observes the sport from the outside, and what he sees in 2026 is both validating and sobering.
No one has stepped in to fight against the UFC, I feel like. And anyone who speaks out against them, you're just a disgruntled former athlete, or, you know, you're just, you got CTE, or you got punched in the head too many times.
Brown addressed the wave of pay criticism from Ronda Rousey and Jon Jones in March 2026, and his take is the one that cuts through the emotion to the infrastructure. He's on Jones's side completely, but Brown also pushes back on Rousey's framing at times, suggesting she can lean into what he calls a victim mentality in ways that muddy the legitimate arguments she's making. Brown offers a sobering reality check, but the final voice in this conversation brings something different: the perspective of an Olympic champion who understands both the business and the culture, and who has some pointed things to say about why fighters, not just the UFC, need to change their mindset. Henry Cejudo has earned the right to speak plainly, and plain is exactly how he speaks. Henry Cejudo. Henry Cejudo's story begins not in a gym, but in a level of adversity that makes championship gold feel like its inevitable destination. Born February 9, 1987 in Los Angeles to Mexican immigrant parents, Cejudo grew up in poverty, the kind that doesn't leave you quickly, that follows you into adulthood and shapes every decision you make. He channeled that hardship into wrestling, and at the 2008 Beijing Olympics, at just 21 years old, became the youngest American to win a freestyle wrestling gold medal, the youngest in history. He transitioned to MMA in 2013, debuted in the UFC, and rose steadily through the flyweight division before doing something that felt almost impossible: dethroning Demetrius Johnson, widely considered pound for pound the greatest fighter who ever lived, for the flyweight championship in 2018. Then he moved up and won the bantamweight title in 2019 against Dominic Cruz, making him one of the rare 2-division champions in UFC history. His record stands at 16-5, and despite a couple of losses and comeback attempts, his legacy is secure: Olympic gold, 2 UFC belts, a combination of athletic achievement that very few people in any combat sport can approach. Post-retirement, Cejudo co-hosts the Pound for Pound podcast with Kamaru Usman, a platform where he delivers exactly the kind of unfiltered, accountability-forward analysis that has made him as compelling outside the cage as he was inside it.
Yeah, I'll tell you why.
Why?
Because a lot of these foreign fighters that have never been paid, that have fought on the street for free, they're happy with the $100,000 bonus. They're happy with just getting famous.
On a March 2026 episode of Pound for Pound, Cejudo sat across from Usman and took on the fighter pay crisis with the same bluntness he brought to championship fights. He agreed, yes, the UFC can and should pay fighters more, especially given the scale of the Paramount deal. But Cejudo's argument goes somewhere that most of his peers haven't been willing to go, inward. He drew a sharp distinction between how American fighters and foreign athletes perceive their earnings. Many international fighters, he argued, arrive in the UFC from backgrounds where $100,000 represents life-changing money, more than they or their families could have imagined. That mindset, understandable and even admirable in its context, becomes a systemic problem when it keeps the broader fighter population from demanding what the market should actually bear. And Cejudo, at 39 and retired, is more focused on ensuring others take those steps than in lamenting the ones he missed. This brings us to the last fighter on our list, Justin Gaethje. The highlight. Gaethje is a former interim lightweight champion and one of the most respected warriors in the UFC. Born on November 14, 1988 in Safford, Arizona, Gaethje wrestled at the University of Northern Colorado, where he became a two-time NCAA Division All-American. He turned professional in MMA in 2012 and quickly gained a reputation for his aggressive, high-volume striking, iron chin, and willingness to engage in brutal, fan-friendly wars. Gaethje joined the UFC in 2017 after dominating in the World Series of Fighting, WSOF, where he was the lightweight champion. In the octagon, he has delivered memorable performances against the likes of Eddie Alvarez, Dustin Poirier, Tony Ferguson, Michael Chandler, and Rafael Fiziev. He captured the interim lightweight title in 2020 with a fifth-round TKO of Ferguson at UFC 249, and has since challenged for the undisputed belt multiple times. As of early 2026, Gaethje's UFC record stands around 8-5, overall pro record 26-5, with multiple Fight of the Night and Performance of the Night bonuses. Known for his no-nonsense personality, loyalty to his team, Elevation Fight Team, and advocacy for fighter safety and pay, Gaethje remains a top contender in the stacked lightweight division and continues to headline cards despite the physical toll of his style. In 2026, Gaethje was one of the most direct and vocal critics of UFC fighter compensation, particularly in response to the organization's massive $7.7 billion media rights deal with Paramount and the lack of meaningful raises for athletes. Unlike some who tempered their comments or focused narrowly on external signings, Gaethje has repeatedly pointed out that promised pay increases have not materialized.
Oh man, to have 14 bonuses and not equal up to $1 million, it's not right. It's not right. It should be a lot more than that.
In interviews and at UFC 300, UFC 24 Media Day, he stated bluntly that there has been no higher fighter pay in 2026, despite the new deal, and he expressed strong dissatisfaction with the bonus structure. To have 14 bonuses and not equal up to $1 million is not right, Gaethje said. It's not right. It should be a lot more than that. He highlighted how even with multiple bonus wins over his career, the total extra money falls far short of what fighters endure in grueling training camps, weight cuts, and long-term health risks. Gaethje has called out the disparity between the UFC's booming revenue and the stagnant or minimally adjusted purses, noting that he and other main event fighters are not seeing the financial uplift that was hyped with the Paramount agreement. At 37 years old and still competing at the highest level, his criticism carries significant weight because it comes from a fighter who has consistently delivered highlight reel performances and put his body on the line for the sport. Thanks for watching. Check out other cards on the screen.